before I get started, so as you can see from the title of this research, we're looking at, this is a study that would not be possible without the support of, or just without the relationship that UH Manoa has with our Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division. Over the course of the past 15 plus years, we have been able to work with our Department of Health to better understand what is happening in therapist offices from month to month as they're working with a wide range of different youth. And my study would be absolutely impossible without that relationship. So happy to have David Jackson here, who handed me over my data set for this study, and I'm extremely grateful for that continued relationship. I think it's really important, and I hope that after you learn about this study, you will glean. I know this isn't the first of these talks that has been based on CAMHD data, but I think this would just be another example of how useful and fruitful that relationship can be for understanding evidence-based practices. So, agenda for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about, time out. Oh, gotcha, thank you. Thanks, Albert, my logistician. We have these slides available online under the Resources tab of your Zoom page, so you can download those to follow along, and I'll let you know where we're at. So I just moved from slide 1 to slide 2, so I'll give you a little indicator when I jump to the next slide. Excuse me, sorry, that's at helpyourkeiki.com. So if you go into helpyourkeiki.com, click on the Resources tab, and then you can pull these slides. We have it? Yeah, okay. All right, so Resources, What's New, and then you will find the link. It says Upcoming EBS Roundtable Presentation, and that's where you can pull the slides. Thanks, Albert. Does anybody need a second to grab that before I get moving, or do you want to just kind of catch up to me as we go? We'll keep going. All right, so we're on slide number 2, our agenda for today. So briefly going to talk about what we know about exposure therapy, and then we'll just jump right into the study. I won't spend a ton of time on our method and results, but we used a little bit of an innovative method to work with a pretty complicated data set. So I wanted to try to make a little bit of sense out of that, because I think it can inform how we approach this sort of complicated, multi-level and variable sort of system of care type of research questions. And then we'll spend some time on discussion about what these results mean for us as practitioners and as service administrators. So maybe by show of hands, I can see 3 of you on the VTC, and for you guys here, just to kind of gauge knowledge and understanding before we get started, who here feels like they could probably provide a fairly good functional definition of exposure therapy? Just raise your hand if you think you could. Okay. All right. So a few of you might not. So all right, so sort of first learning moment right now. So important to understand what this is, because I'm going to spend my entire time talking about it. So exposure therapy is one of the probably earliest research psychological interventions in sort of the course of empirical research on treatment for psychological problems. It goes all the way back to the earliest of behaviorists. Some of you guys may be familiar, even anecdotally, with little Albert, who was a subject of Watson, who's kind of considered the father of behaviorism, where he basically took this little baby boy and presented the boy with various white, small, generally considered cute white animals, and then paired those animals with a loud sound, such that it conditioned the boy to eventually fear the white animals without the presence of the sound. And then a decade or so later, Jones sort of took that process and reversed it. Found children who were afraid of small animals and paired those small animals with a mealtime experience, such that over repeated pairings between the animals and the mealtime, the fear of of the animals was kind of replaced by this positive association of mealtime. And so the children stopped being afraid of the animals. And that kind of is a really basic conceptual sort of framework for how exposure works. With the broader idea that exposure is meant to place a client in proximity to a feared stimulus. And that can be anything from something specific, like an animal, to something more ephemeral, like persistent, anxious, worrisome thoughts, to situations like novel new social situations where a client might fear some kind of judgment. So across a wide range of settings, basically the participant is placed into those settings in a therapeutic, adaptive way so that they learn that whatever the feared consequence of that stimulus is, does not occur, or at least it occurs within the client's ability to control. And over repeated trials, the client begins to learn an alternative relationship between that stimulus and the potential outcomes. And the idea is that that new relationship over practice sort of kind of wears a deeper path into the client's brain, and that sort of replaces or at least overrides the pathological response to the stimulus. So, and this can be done across a whole bunch of different ways. It can be done gradually, sort of step by step. You start with kind of less feared situations, and then you kind of move up as you master the less difficult stuff. It can be done through flooding, where you just bombard the client with all the feared stimuli, and they kind of just figure it out and slowly change the pattern of thinking over time. It can be done through virtual reality. It can be done imaginally. It can be done related to your own physiological state. If you fear the sense of your heart racing, if that creates anxiety, or if you notice you have these sort of hypersensitivity to various bodily sensations. So it works across a wide range of contexts, and what we know about it is over time we found that exposure therapy in particular has been found to be efficacious. So I'll be using the words efficacy and effectiveness today, not interchangeably. Efficacious referring to the idea that we are trying to get at the core underlying effect of an intervention by controlling for all the other stuff. So comparing the intervention to some other type of control, either a wait list or a placebo or some other treatment. And then also controlling for variability across the different people that we treat, trying to pinpoint particular diagnoses and maybe exclude others. So exposure has been found to be efficacious, especially for specific phobias going way back. But more recently, exposure has been grouped into a wider range of protocols, a greater sort of manualized treatment that you all know as cognitive behavioral therapy. So CBT for anxiety and related problems includes exposure among other practices over the course of a treatment episode. So our modern understanding of exposure therapy is mainly, not completely, but mainly driven by our understanding of CBT for anxiety. Does CBT work better than a control? And we found that CBT has at least burgeoning and sometimes very well-established evidence across various psychological problems, from traumatic stress to obsessions and compulsions, social anxiety, separation anxiety, fears and phobias, generalized anxiety. Now, moving to that other term, effectiveness. So when we have traditionally examined CBT and exposure, we are attempting to get at the root effect of the intervention. And so we're controlling for a lot of things. Now, the other side of empirical research on treatment effectiveness, or on treatment impact, has to do with when we take those interventions that have been carefully tested, and then we put them out into the so-called real world and compare it to what a child or adolescent, in this case, would be getting otherwise. So you take the lab-tested intervention and see if it still stands up to when it's when you look at it compared to anything else that might be done. And the thing about, and we know a lot less about exposure in that case. There are not, so far, extant effectiveness studies that examine exposure by itself compared to what else therapists might be doing for anxiety. What we do have are a couple of effectiveness studies related to CBT for anxiety versus treatment as usual, or usual care. And what we found so far has suggested that in those studies, most often, especially for youth, the CBT intervention has not been shown to have any superior impact compared to the usual care services. There are two studies that have looked into this extensively so far in the lab, and they're both relatively new within the last 10 years. But an open question is, if you take, so one idea is that maybe we don't really know how much of that CBT intervention is exposure, and how much of it is these other practices within that manualized intervention. And in fact, in both of those studies, exposure wasn't tracked specifically. So maybe exposure is the active ingredient in the CBT intervention manualized process, and if we were to isolate it in some way, we could get a sense of whether the use of exposure kind of adds to or enhances outcomes. A reason why that's a relevant question to ask is because across studies, exposure has been found to be sort of almost pervasively underused. In community mental health studies, we found exposure is used for anxiety-related cases in 10 to 35% of occasions when anxiety is the salient problem. And even among CBT specialists for PTSD, we found that those trained and certified practitioners only use exposure in about 55 to 60% of cases. So even under the best circumstances with the best training, it's not used all the time. So we might think that so number one, maybe there is something to exposure specifically that is driving therapeutic change, and also we want to know if we are assuming that it does work, how can we potentially promote its use? So that leads us to the study questions today. And before I'll stop there. Now I'm on slide 4. There are study questions. Before I get into these, does anybody have any questions about exposure, about the history of exposure research so far? Okay. So the two main questions that we have, I hope I kind of led you to them through my introduction, are what predicts exposure use, given it is not, we think that it is underused in community mental health, and then does the use of exposure predict treatment progress above and beyond the usual care services that youth receive? And of course, we're looking at our system of care. So a couple of hypotheses. In the system, many of you are aware of the efforts that have been made to promote the use of evidence-based practices over the last decade plus. So we are assuming, we thought that the more recent an episode was, the more recent the treatment occurred, the more likely therapists would use exposure. That was one major hypothesis. The second was, so in my thesis work, I looked at the disproportionate focus on externalizing problems in the same level of the same system of care when therapists were presented with diagnoses that were both internalizing and externalizing. So just briefly, externalizing problems with the environment. So disruptive behavior, ADHD, especially combined and hyperactive types, the things that result in problems outside of the self. And then internalizing problems kind of conceptualizes within the self, depression, anxiety, somatic complaints, those sorts of problems. So what we found is that when therapists were presented with youth who had both an externalizing diagnosis and an internalizing diagnosis, they tended to focus more on the externalizing problems. And so just a follow-up to that is that maybe given that disproportionate focus, that the more externalizing problems a therapist focuses on treatment, the less likely they'll be to use exposure. And then a lot of the research suggested that higher levels of education predicted an increased impression of exposure as an effective intervention, and also increased use. So that was one of the hypotheses we tested. And And then simply with exposure use predicting treatment progress, we looked at kind of things that you might think were pretty intuitive, that the more months of exposure use, the better the outcomes. And then the earlier the use in an episode, we'd see enhanced progress as well. And that's based on a couple of different studies. One that showed better diagnostic remission rates with more exposure sessions in an entire treatment episode. And then a more recent study that showed if you used exposure in the first couple of sessions as opposed to the 7th or 8th session, that the entire treatment episode would be shorter because the goals would be met faster. So we are looking at a really just we have a rare opportunity to examine this question in a diverse and broad and nuanced data set that has to do. So this sample had, we had 6,600 treatment episodes provided to about 3,500 youth by over 600 therapists and 83 agencies, I think. So making sense of the variability within all of those different categories was both difficult but also really telling. Who here, another sort of check for understanding to determine how much I talk about this. We are on slide 5 now, by the way. Bad at prompting you on this. I'll get better as we go. I apologize. If by show of hands, if I could get who has a pretty good familiarity with the scope of services provided through our Department of Health, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division, just by show of hands. Okay. All right. So a couple folks don't. So I'll just speak briefly. So basically, our Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division was largely created in response to a consent decree by the federal government and resulted in a system of care that includes multiple levels of services. And these services range from your standard outpatient services all the way to hospital-based locked residential facilities and many things in between. If you were to break them down to their finest categories, there's 20 plus different categories of services. And the idea is that the service system operates on the principle of least restrictive care, that you put a youth in the level of care that responds to a severe emotional or behavioral disturbance. So these kids have to meet a certain criterion in order to be admitted, and that you put them in a level of care that is meant to best match with their level of impairment. And one of the great things about this system is that we have some means to track what is done over the course of an episode. So I'm going to say treatment episode a lot in this talk. So a treatment episode, just for everybody, just to kind of orient everyone, is basically when a youth interacts with a given clinician within a given level of care. So if a youth is in a therapeutic foster home for 8 months, and then they leave that therapeutic foster home and maybe go to a different level of care, or they drop out of the system. So that space of 8 months in that level of care with the therapist is the episode for that youth. So we'll start talking a little bit about what this sample looks like. So going broad to more specific, so you have 83 different, I got that right, 83 different agencies providing services. This is across 4 of the major Hawaiian islands, the main Hawaiian islands. And you can see that there are many ways that you can potentially break these levels of care. I'm on slide 6 now. Break these levels of care down and describe them. But I tried to be as parsimonious as possible. These are the 9 conceptual categories of level of care, and they kind of range from the most intensive to the least intensive. So you can take a look at that sort of spectrum of services. So go all intensive in-home, outpatient, and then into a couple of different family therapy services that are manualized, and then into the different out-of-home placements. Now, these services were provided by over 650 therapists. Most of them were master's level, as you can see from the second underlined, now we're on slide 7, the second underlined row, almost 90%, and then there were about 10% who were doctorate level. So I distinguished between those two because, like I said, we're predicting that maybe doctorate degree might be related to an increased use of exposure. And then these, I won't go through this whole table, but these were the youth. We saw 3,500 youth with at least one anxiety target. So therapists endorsed treating something related to anxiety at least once in the course of that treatment episode. And you know, we can spend a little time on this, but I think the key points to note here is this is an extremely diverse sample, though it is predominantly male, 60% and an interesting thing is, if you notice in the count of primary diagnosis, so the first bullet there, disruptive behavior, this is slide 8, by the way, if you guys haven't moved on yet, is the most common diagnosis, even in this sample of youth who receive treatment for anxiety. And that kind of points to sort of the system, what we understand about the system of care. It tends to, and sort of goes back to what I described about the disproportionate focus on externalizing problems, that there might also be a disproportionate referral for externalizing problems in the system of care.
Pat?
Yes?
What was the span of your research?
This data set was ranged from June 2006 to August 2015. July 1st, 2006 to August 2015, the middle of August 2015, or the end of August 2015. And the reason for that was because in 2006, the CAMHD began requiring the submission of MTPS as the form that we use to look at these different therapist behaviors in order to be reimbursed. So the data become a lot more reliable at that point in time. But the data set, the whole data set goes all the way back to, I think, 2001 is what my earliest record was from the larger scope of data. Other questions before I move on? All right, so one more show of hands question, and then I'll leave you alone. Who here is familiar with or has a fairly decent understanding of the monthly treatment progress summary? Okay, a couple of you do not. All right, so I'll try to keep this brief. The monthly treatment progress summary is a self-report therapist form that is completed once per month, as I mentioned, mandatory, and it basically gives the therapist a place to indicate the problems that they targeted in treatment. That's on slide 9, so you'll see these targets addressed this month. They can circle up to 10, and then they can also indicate the progress that they've made on those targets. So if you're looking at slide 10, you'll see that this study focused on 4 targets: anxiety, avoidance, phobias and fears, and traumatic stress. These were 4 targets that both theoretically and empirically seem to fit together in some important ways, and that we understand as being a target for exposure and exposure-related treatment. So then once you endorse any of these 4 categories, any of these 4 targets, at least once in an episode, then that particular episode qualifies for this study. Then what you do next, if you go to slide 10, you rate for each of those targets, you rate the therapist rates the perceived improvement for the youth on any of those targets. Basically, that turns into a 0 to 6 scale, with 0 reflecting deterioration and 6 reflecting complete improvement. So that was the major outcome variable for this study. This is what we were looking at when we were looking at that second question, whether exposure use predicts enhanced progress. This is the score that we're examining. And then the final piece of this form, this MTPS, well, it's not the final piece, but that we're concerned about with this study is the intervention strategies used. So the therapist says, it indicates what practices or what targets they addressed, they indicate the improvement on those targets, and they indicate what they did in relation to those targets, in that same month to work on those problems. And so we looked at anyone who endorsed exposure during the course of a treatment episode. Questions about that form, about the MTPS, before I move on? Okay, so now this, I won't belabor this, but if you go to slide 12, this gives, I think, a somewhat intelligible map of why these data are difficult to work with. And that is because, so what we want to make sure is that if we're trying to examine the potential impacts of exposure therapy, we want to make sure that there aren't other things that explain those impacts that are sort of hidden within the data. And so we are looking at episodes, so a course of treatment, and that course of treatment is given to provided to a youth by a therapist within an agency. And now you might think that's a nice little funnel, right? That the episode is housed within the youth, which is housed within the therapist, which is housed within the agency. But we examined multiple episodes over the course of a youth's time in the system. I think the mean number of episodes was close to 3. I can tell you, let's see. Yeah, 2.85 mean episodes for each kid. So we looked at all of them. And now, the first episode that a kid has in our system might be provided by one therapist, while the second might be provided by a different therapist under a completely different level of care. And so there isn't a nice and neat nesting of these things, which is helpful when you're trying to do the stats related to this stuff. But thankfully, UH has a professor who has written a textbook on how to handle these complicated data. He happened to serve on my dissertation committee, and it basically suffices to say that through a process called cross-classified modeling, you can kind of get at the variance within each of these levels, even if they're not neatly housed within each other. And that's what this study did. It accounted for agency effects, it accounted for therapist effects, it accounted for client effects, and it accounted for episode effects. So you can kind of hold all that stuff constant and saying, even with all that crazy stuff going on, does exposure seem to make a difference? So while this is not an experimental study like I was describing, efficacy research with really heavy experimental controls, we attempted as much as possible to control for as much of the random variance as we could. Would anybody like to talk more about analysis, or shall I move on? Because I could talk about analysis for the rest of our time. And I
we trust you. You have a nice bloody face. We're waiting with bated breath for the results.
All right. So preliminary findings. So within this level of care, now we are on slide 13. Oh, was there a question? I'm sorry. So there was exclusion criteria were episodes that began prior to July 1st, 2006 were excluded. Any youth who did not have any anxiety target endorsed within a treatment episode were excluded. And I believe that was it. We really tried to cast as wide of a net as possible. And that's a good question because it gets at the variability of the sample. We can talk about that a little bit more when we get to the discussion if you're interested, because the question comes up is how many of these kids were just being treated for anxiety and how many of them was anxiety sort of a secondary focus in a broader treatment course that was maybe more externalizing. Good question. Yes, Dr. Slade.
Well, just a comment. I think if you're not familiar with our system, you need to understand kind of the universe. So all of the kids met some kind of criteria for inclusion in CAMHD.
That's a really good point.
And they were excluded if they didn't meet those criteria.
Good point. Sure. So maybe we can talk about that as well. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Simon. So a big exclusion criterion is whether you are enrolled in the system of care or not. And being in the system of care requires a significant level of impairment, which our primary measure is something called the CAFS. It's a functional impairment scale, and they have to have a score that represents pretty considerable impairment to get in. And of course, they have to be referred. Often they are referred when, going back to sort of how our system of care was developed, the Department of Education is kind of the primary treatment provider for these kids for the lower levels of impairment. And when the Department of Education was unable to manage these problems within the school setting, often they would be bumped up to Department of Health Services. Now, that's not the universal model. Kids can also, and I think predominantly, you're looking at kids who are referred through Quest, through subsidized public health insurance. But the idea is that the impairment is relatively severe, that you're not looking at your sort of mild cases. You're often not looking at cases where families can afford private services as well. So there might be some SES-related exclusion criteria as well that are not measured discretely here, but given that sort of understanding of the overall environment. So, does that get at that accurately enough, Dr. Slater? Thanks. Okay. So, as this basically just gives a real broad look at the two variables we're going to examine for the two research questions. We're on slide 13 right now. So for study aim number 1, so this was predicting exposure use. We really just looked simply at whether within an episode exposure was ever used or if it wasn't used at all. And what you can see there is that when anxiety was targeted at least once in a treatment episode, exposure was only used within the whole sample about 21% of the time. And then that second study aim, and this is getting to the impact, the potential impact of exposure. We examined exposure from a series of categories of the amount of use. So this is a monthly measure, that MTPS that I mentioned. So the most specifically that we can get at exposure use is, at least in this study, was how many months it was used in an episode. And of course, there are issues with that we can discuss with that lack of specificity. But that's how in the second block, study aim 2, that's how exposure use broke down. It was not used for an anxiety target in 5,400 episodes, and then used for an anxiety target in most cases in 1 month, and then in reduced cases in 2 to 3 months, and then our last category was 4+ months of exposure. I want you to keep that in your mind as we go into the results, kind of that will frame your thinking about our findings. So beginning with study 1, so what predicted exposure use? You don't need to make too much sense of these stats. I'm happy to describe them more if you're interested, but they're as much of a reference for me to guide my discussion with you as they are for you. But these three, on slide 14, these three rows represent our hypotheses about exposure use. So what we found was that episode end date did predict exposure use. Exposure use became more frequent or more likely as the start date of the episodes increased, moved forward in time. We also found that, as predicted, the more a therapist focused on externalizing problems, so the more they addressed the rule breaking and the anger and the hyperactivity, the less likely they were to choose exposure when treating anxiety. And then we found that doctorate degree had no effect, no matter how we measured it. Doctorate degree, really, folks with a doctorate in this system of care used exposure at about the same rate as the rest of the sample. Just to put this in perspective, so when you're thinking about dissemination efforts, how we did at promoting the use of exposure, looking at slide 15, you can see that at the start, the first kind of 6-month period of the study, exposure was used for 12% of the cases in that window. And then at the last date range of the study, it was used 21% of the time. So you can see an increase, almost kind of getting close toward a doubling in the rate of use over time. But as you can see, 21%. So progress, certainly not necessarily success. And then just kind of putting that, using something that's understandable to get at those externalizing targets. So basically, if a therapist didn't focus at all on externalizing problems during treatment, so they were sort of laser focused on either internalizing stuff or other stuff, there was a 25% chance of them using exposure. And if they focused on externalizing problems in every single month of treatment along with anxiety, then that brought the likelihood of use down by about 6%. So not, obviously not giant effects, but considering the number of episodes and the variability in the system, meaningful effects potentially. And then this, so now moving to slide 16. So I'll talk about this in more depth as we get to the discussion. But basically, this is representative of many of the variables that we also tested just to control for them, so that we could get at whether we were really getting at the likelihood of exposure use, whether like meaningful predictors. So we looked at things like how many months in treatment, and whether there was an anxiety-related diagnosis, and race, and age, and gender, the sex in this case, functional impairment. So, and I'll discuss those things a little bit more as we get further in. And then there were those were the significant predictors. So a big list of significant predictors along with the hypothesized ones that I mentioned. And then there were a few that were non-significant. Number of previous treatment episodes. Gender didn't seem to have any effect, or sex didn't seem to have any effect, and age didn't seem to have any effect on whether or not a therapist used exposure. So that's a very just broad stroke brief look at the findings for the first part of the study. What predicts exposure use? Open it up for any questions, any clarifying questions or thoughts that you might have before I move to the second study question. Okay, moving on. All right, so for our second study game, what predicts total anxiety progress? So basically what I had to do in order to get at anxiety progress was I had to take all the progress related to each of those 4 targets that I mentioned. So therapists could treat anxiety, phobias and fears, avoidance, or traumatic stress, and the case would be qualified for inclusion in the study. So we took all those and kind of averaged out their final progress rating at the end of treatment and came up with this total anxiety progress measure. That's the one at the bottom of slide 18. And as you can see, it's pretty reasonably normally distributed, especially for such a wide and diverse data set. And you can see kind of what it's made up of. There's some sort of, I think, noteworthy trends in the individual progress on those 4 targets. You can see that, so as the curve is kind of skewed to the left, where there's sort of the outliers on the left, that suggests that maybe therapists are doing better on those targets. And as it's skewed kind of to the right, as most of the data, the clumps on the left-hand side, they're not doing as well. So you can see phobias and fears seems to be, the progress seems to be a little bit higher on average than, say, traumatic stress or avoidance. And anxiety maybe as well, a little bit better progress on the anxiety target than the avoidance or traumatic stress target. So looking at those individual targets one more time just to orient you. Now, we're looking at the amount of exposure use. The key here is how many months was exposure used for any of these targets, and what was the associated progress. So these tables on slide 19 indicate that at the bivariate level. So without considering all these other predictors and multiple levels of data that we're analyzing, what does this look like at a basic level? And what you can see here is that for that 4+ month category, across all of these measures of anxiety-related progress, there's a jump. That the numbers seem to stay pretty static from 0 to 1 month to 2 to 3 months. Maybe there's an exception in traumatic stress, and maybe a little bit in avoidance. But in general, the progress on these problems stays pretty flat until you get to the 4+ month category, and then there's a jump. And so that's telling, but we don't know what to make of that until we account for things like the length of a treatment episode or other factors that might kind of obfuscate those findings. So when we do, when we include all of the various other predictors, gender and age and level of care and therapist random effects and doctorate degree and type of diagnoses, what we find is in the whole system of care that 4+ month distinction persists. So that 3.42, so now orienting yourself back to that NTPS. NTPS is on a 0 to 6 scale, right? 0 is deterioration, 6 is near complete progress, 91 to 100% progress. So 3.42 is a little bit above the middle. I'm sorry, it's actually right at the middle. Because it's kind of a 7-point scale. So 3.42 there's a sorry, that's not right. So it's actually a little bit below the middle, right? So 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 4 is in the middle. 3.42, a little bit below the middle of the road in progress. And that number was significantly greater than any of the other categories of exposure use. So basically, not using exposure at all, using it for 1 month, or using it for 2 to 3 months as endorsed by the MTPS. All those progress ratings were not significantly different from one another, but the use of it for 4+ months was higher than any of those 3 categories. And as I mentioned, that was also after considering a number of other factors, like the length of treatment, how many other practices a therapist used, again, the proportion of months that externalizing targets were focused on, the proportion of months devoted to anxiety-related targets, and we can talk a little bit more about those as we go. Now, so that was kind of the main effect when we looked at the entire sample across all levels of care, that we found this effect of 4+ months of exposure use seeming to result in better progress. But what we found also was, as we looked at these different levels of care, so now I'm on slide 22. When we looked at the different levels of care, there was a lot of disparity in the overall anxiety progress in each of these levels of care. And so I ranked them here from lowest to highest. So as you can see, mean progress on anxiety in community-based residential treatment was over a point lower than mean progress within the functional family therapy context. And we could talk a little bit about the grouping of these different levels of care and why we might think that one does better on anxiety than another, if we can get to that. But the reason this is important for this study is we needed to control for that. We needed to see if maybe exposure use varies within each of these levels of care. So we reran all the analyses and looked at the interaction between exposure use, those months of exposure use, and each of these individual levels of care. And what we found, as we go to slide 23, is, by and large, the driving effect for this study, the place where exposure really seemed to make a difference, was in the community-based residential treatment setting. There was a small, non-significant effect in intensive in-home settings, and here. And if you look here, there is over a point difference between the use of exposure for 4+ months compared to the use of it for 0 months and 2 to 3 months, and almost a point compared to the 1 month category of use. So, and those significant findings occurred in the context of a number of other non-significant findings, including, again, sex, anxiety diagnosis, race, age, doctorate degree. None of these predicted whether or not a youth did better with exposure therapy. So, I'd like to frame my discussion from, frame the discussion from, we'll talk about limitations, things to consider as we are interpreting these results briefly. And then we'll go back to the study aim number 1, and then go into study aim number 2. So we'll kind of address each of those in turn. But before I jump into this, does anybody have any immediate pressing thoughts after looking at those results? So sort of, again, summarizing, exposure is used about 20% of the time over the course of the 9 years of this data set. when accounting for all sorts of various different characteristics of both the treatment episode, the youth, the therapist, the level of care. And a couple of important things predicted of our hypothesized predictors. That the more recently it was used, the more likely it was to be used, and the less of a focus on externalizing problems, the more likely it was to be used. Then we looked at the potential effectiveness, looking at the relationship between outcomes and exposure use. We found that when exposure was used for 4 or more months, that resulted or that was related to enhanced outcomes, but that effect was mainly driven by the cases that were seen in the community-based residential setting. Okay? Yes.
So does that include all 3 levels of community-based residential?
Yeah. Do you mean CBR 1, 2, and 3?
Yeah.
Yes. So CBR 3 was its own category. CBR 1 was was grouped within hospital-based residential because that we could conceptualize that as sort of a locked program. Wait, let me make sure that I have that right. Let's go back to our levels of care. Okay, so CBR and just the nomenclature for CBR 1, 2, and 3. I know CBR 3 includes things like Bobby Benson and Mary Med, unlocked facilities. CBR 2, are we referencing particularly just the Catholic Charities?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. And then CBR 1 is
Benchmark.
simply benchmark, right? Okay, got it. So in this study, we grouped benchmark as its and CBR 2 as their own separate category.
Okay.
And then CBR 1 included Kahimahala and Queens as well. And then CBR 3 was all of the unlocked facilities. So those were separated. Thanks for the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions before we talk a little bit more about? Yes. On BTC.
Just out of curiosity, because I'm just thinking of the level of cares, right? Hospital-based or more outpatient-based. So how were the sample sizes in terms of the time size, or month, 2 months? I mean, was it a case that there were, I guess, more 1-month cases in the hospital cases while there were less 3 or 4-month cases? And how may that have influenced the findings? If my question makes any sense.
It absolutely makes sense. Yes. And let's see if I have a table that indicates that. I might not. Yes, I do. Okay, so this if you can read this. So now I'm on slide. I don't have the slide for you guys. This wasn't part of my main slide. But generally speaking, 0 months across all of the different categories was by far the most frequent of any of the categories. If we move to hospital-based services, which was your question, there is a sort of a slower drop-off in that category, going from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 months to 4+ months than in the other categories. Likely, as you're, I think, alluding to, the fact that stays should be shorter in hospital-based residential services. Though, interestingly, there are quite a few, 75 that were over 2 months long, 78 that were over 2 months long in those last 2 higher use categories. Apart from hospital-based services, it's kind of a really steep drop-off. So, for example, in community-based residential treatment, there were 630 episodes with no exposure use, and then you drop down to 90 with 1 month, 89 with 2 to 3 months, and 64 with 4+ months. So that's, I think, a little bit more typical across the different levels of care. That sort of big drop-off from 0, and then a slow decline as you move through the higher frequency months of use. Does that make sense?
Much it sounds like overall, is that in terms of the length of time of the subjects?
Say that one more time.
I'm sorry. It sounds like then, from what you were saying, there
Yes. Oh, sorry. I'm blowing out the speakers. I apologize for the emphatic response. Good question. Any other questions before I keep going?
We can
Talk
do
a little bit more about this.
just a quick summary, and then we can have Dr. Humphrey and Shelley's reactions.
Oh, sure.
Is that okay? Yeah. Just quick
Okay.
summary.
So, thanks. So basically, what we found was a series of other meaningful predictors of both exposure use and progress ratings. And, without, I think for the sake of clarity, I'll just mention them briefly. There's the idea that overall summary with regard to exposure use is that therapists seem to make relatively thoughtful decisions about when to use or not use exposure. So factors like the more varied anxiety targets, whether there was an anxiety-related diagnosis, the impairment related to anxiety, these were all related to an increased likelihood of use. So basically, it seemed as though when anxiety was a more salient or pervasive problem, therapists tended to focus on it more, which is encouraging. That maybe in the severe cases, therapists might turn to exposure because they might think that it would be more helpful. You had a question?
Well, I'm one of the few lay people here that sat here for a very long time, 10 or 15 years, and I had the impression that exposure was a very effective treatment of anxiety, and I've been disappointed over time to see our local providers not being encouraged or not encouraging themselves to use it more so that we have better outcomes.
Sure.
So you were talking about them making thoughtful decisions about whether to use it, but it seems like 4/5 of them decide not to use it at all.
That's right.
How are we going anywhere with that?
Sure. Really good question. Maybe we'll just end with that because I think that kind of gets into the effectiveness as well. So importantly, exposure seems to work, and it seems to work better than not using it, but only in a specific set of conditions, right? Which, in my mind, it doesn't mean that exposure only works in community-based residential settings, but what that reflects to me potentially is a proxy for when you can get a kid outside of the environment that might interfere with exposure use. So one reason why therapists might not use it is because sometimes it's hard. It's hard to do. It's hard to get a kid to practice. It's hard to get, that you want consistency, and you can much more easily just sit and talk with a youth, rather than maybe setting up situations where you take them out into the community, into a specific situation where they have to confront that stimulus. So there might be some work involved. And the CBR setting gets you out of that. The kid's always going to show up. You can check in on the homework from day to day. And so that suggests that maybe there's something about fidelity that's important to consider. And then that 4+ months, similarly, I don't think reflects that exposure must be done in 4 or more months in order for it to be useful. But it does weed out a lot of the variance. And maybe therapists who try it once and drop it, or maybe therapists who kind of say that they're doing it without actually really putting full focus on it. That's our best sort of, because we can't really measure that in this data set. So what that says to me is, yes, we need to find additional ways to promote the use of exposure, but it's not just the use, it is the effective use, the use with some sort of high fidelity. And so coming up with ways to measure that in our system of care, ways that can get at whether a therapist is truly doing good exposure therapy. It's just some simple modifications to this MTPS form, some of which are actually in the pipeline, could be helpful at getting at that better. As well as and then there's an innovative training model that Dr. Nakamura is heading up that involves sort of a train the trainer means of getting more of the system therapists on board with some of these interventions, where more consistent oversight and kind of longitudinal both supervision of these different interventions as well as the sort of training up and like checking for fidelity, we're hopeful might result in some increased use and increased quality of use.
So I'll introduce the discussants. One other quick thing about that is, with Catholic Charities and Dr. Slavin's work, what we don't see is, so the overall average is 20%, but data from RET suggests that it's been a pretty steep increase over the last years with the introduction of a variety of big projects like Project CAMHD and a variety of things. So across
Right.
11 years, it's 20%, but I think it's been as low as 4 or 5%. And then the system is, I think it's about pretty much at its all-time high. So thanks to some of the work of our providers and the training from Clinical Services Office. But without further ado, we're looking for a quick some points of discussion from two people that might be able to speak particularly to this in terms of just maybe initial reactions for anybody else in the room as well. First, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Kurt Humphrey, and he has recently become the medical director at CAMHD after spending 4 years as a psychiatrist for CAMHD's Family Court Liaison Branch. He completed medical school, residency, and fellowship at the University of Colorado. And when he is not working, he enjoys movies, hiking, and traveling. And for all the Myers-Briggs fans out there, he is a proud INFJ. That's why he's ripping that. Shelley Miles is currently a program director for Catholic Charities Hawaii, Ohana Ulama, Transitional Family Homes, and Horizons Independent Living Program. Prior to becoming program director, she was the program therapist for Catholic Charities Transitional Family Home and CBR2, and she's experienced with providing individual, family, and group therapy for youth in the CBR2 program with sexualized behaviors and other emotional, behavioral, and social issues. She is a licensed mental health counselor and is certified in TFCBT, what we were talking about before. And her previous work experiences also include working with youth and families in adolescent day treatment program, intensive in-home, and healthy start intervention programs. So if we could not only thank Matt, but welcome our discussants. Just any initial reactions or thoughts or questions or anything. It's more to just have a kind of discussion. It's a small group, so just kick around ideas or any initial reaction, something that resonated with you, something that.
I don't really know where to begin or what to say, but I think thank you for the presentation. I think it was very interesting. There's so much data.
Yeah.
I could ask you about all kinds of things, but one of the things that I started thinking about while you were talking was in my training. They taught us how to do exposure, mostly in teaching us how to do this manualized treatment, this coping cat thing, which I don't know if people know about that at all, but does anyone do that in Hawaii? Is that part of this study? Did that come up?
Great question.
We don't do coping cat. I mean, we do a different version
Uh-huh.
of it, but not that specific protocol. But
Okay.
I mean, it's similar in some ways. So the idea of coming up with a fear hierarchy, ranking them, doing graduated exposure, taking ratings before and after. So it's similar in some regards. But coping cat, one way that we're really different, and I think Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, was part of the big training that they did like 8 years ago now, was coping cat. It tends to take a while to get to exposure,
Yeah.
at least 2 months. So you're doing like 8 different elements before, whereas I think on the run we've been trying to train folks to get the kid ready so that they have the coping skills, but to try to hit it when you can,
Mm-hmm.
versus prolonging doing it the 9th session. We try to do it 3, 4, 5 session.
And I think an important point there is, I didn't discuss this in the results, but one thing missing from my discussion of hypothesized results was we didn't find anything related to the recency of exposure use. But that's because most of the time exposure was used in either the first or the second month of treatment. And because of the variance in that, given when you count day one of treatment, it was really hard to parcel out when in those 2 months, like whether that was session 1 or session 6 or 7 or something like that. So we didn't find anything there, but I think it's more because of measurement sensitivity than it's because of it not existing.
That's a fine resource. That's kind of like the gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, coping cat.
It is, for sure.
And I was thinking that, you mentioned how we've done training, primarily recently on trauma-focused CBT, which does have an exposure element, but it's, the trauma narrative. And, well, one thing, I worry sometimes people don't think of the trauma narrative as exposure, but it is a little bit different from like a fear hierarchy type of exposure.
I think I had a little bit of a thought of actually working within a CBR level and being a therapist. So I think why the use is higher, you're right, in that you have a more controlled environment, right?
Yeah.
You can control for factors of practice, and a therapist, at least within our setting, can focus more on that and the behavioral type of thing, which is the other component why you're seeing therapists addressing more the externalizing behavior can be addressed within the therapeutic milieu with the state of day-to-day staff.
Sort of the
And so
structure.
the therapist can focus more on the root of the problem. And then I've been therapists on the other end too, not within the control setting, right? And oftentimes those therapists are tending to the day-to-day crisis, which is oftentimes more externalizing behaviors,
Yeah.
right? And especially I think your proportion of boys in this study compared to girls, right? So their behaviors are going to be very different with anxiety, and you're tending to those kind of externalizing behaviors more than the root of the problem.
That makes sense. I'm glad to hear that from sort of the practical, on the ground experience, that it seems to the results kind of seem to comport. That's really encouraging.
Other thoughts from anybody on VTC or in the room? Susie?
So I'm just wondering, from a parent point of view, if you have an overprotective mother like myself, now my baby is 36 now, but if I had been living with his trauma and his fear of something, and then his therapist suggested that we expose him to that, I might be the one to kill the deal. And I'm wondering, have you taken stock of whether families are being sold on the concept and whether we're doing enough parent outreach and education?
It's a really good question. Couple of meta-analyses on this have suggested that, at least for adolescents, including the parents in therapy for anxiety, does not result in enhanced effects. So, which I think makes some intuitive sense. While certainly a parent can help to maintain a youth's anxiety, but it is something of an individualized process, and so again, it's especially with older youth, the research seems to suggest that if you can get their buy-in, that's the important place. The important work will occur with the youth. That said, for younger children, creating a structure in which a youth is even capable of engaging in relative and exposure exercises often requires the parents' buy-in, requires them getting them to session. So certainly even though we attempt to focus on exposure earlier than, say, the coping cat protocol suggests, prior to exposure is a heavy element of psychoeducation, where we describe both to the youth in language that we hope they understand and to the parent the importance of the process and attempt to get buy-in in that way. Certainly not a slam dunk. So I think you encounter both maybe what you describe as the concern about, is this intervention somehow going to hurt my child, and then on the other side of the spectrum, sort of, is the therapist or is the parent just too busy meeting basic needs to even get a client to session?
Yeah, but that would be an interesting study, right, to see if the association of expected practice elements with exposure was associated with better outcomes.
Sure.
Right, so exposure plus psychoed plus relaxation is better than, I don't know. But
Than just exposure. Mm-hmm.
so probably one more question, and then we'll call it a wrap. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much.